Hi everyone, my name is Nicole and I'm going to walk you through my recipe and tips and tricks on how to make a pumpkin pie. So the first thing I'll go through is some supplies that you're going to need. You'll need a cutting board, baking tray, a pie plate if you're going to make your own crust, some measuring spoons, a knife, some regular spoons, a can opener, and something to mash your pumpkin with. You can also use a blender if you have one on hand. So next I'll go over some of the ingredients and give you some suggestions for dietary adjustments that you may need. So you're going to need 3 cups of pumpkin puree. I'll show you how to bake with the canned version, and I'm also going to teach you how to make your own pumpkin puree. You'll need 1 can of condensed milk. This is available as a dairy option, or there's coconut milk versions as well. You'll need 2 eggs, but feel free to omit those if you don't need them in your diet. You'll also need brown sugar, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and a pinch of salt. If you don't want to buy individual spices, you can also buy pumpkin pie mix ready-made. So to begin, I'll show you how to prepare your pumpkin. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using a butternut squash. Pumpkins are out of season right now, so I wasn't able to get one. But this will be the same process that you'll use for a pumpkin. So the first thing that I did was I gave this squash a really good wash, and then I made sure I dried it for when I was cutting, just so that I didn't slip on anything. So you can see here I'm just cutting off the top and the bottom. And because this squash is kind of a weird shape, I just cut it down the middle so to make it easier for myself to cut it into chunks. This process is pretty straightforward. You just need to kind of cut it down small enough that you can roast it in a reasonable time. So you'll want to make sure that you scrape out all the inside. The top on this one doesn't have very much, but the bottom on a butternut squash has kind of the seeds and the hair that you're used to seeing in a pumpkin. So you want to make sure that's all out. If you're anything like me, you'll have seeds all over the floor and the counter. I did a pretty good job here because I was just doing one. Sometimes when I have pumpkins in my garden, I'll do a huge batch of pumpkin puree. And that's quite the mess. But here I'm just doing the one, so it's not as bad. So I'm just scraping to make sure I get everything out. There's a little bit of hair left in there, or the fuzzy kind of bits, that's okay. It certainly won't hurt your pie. You just don't want to have any seeds floating around in there. So I'm just going to throw these on the tray and get them ready to go. If you have a larger chunk or a lot of pumpkin or squash on the tray, you might want to put a little bit of water in them. It just helps with the cooking. These are good to go. And I'll just show you some images here of them in the oven. I don't really have a set time on how long these need in the oven. I usually start with the oven at about 400 degrees and I'll leave them in for about a half an hour and just kind of feel them for tenderness. They just need to be soft enough that you can put them in the blender or mash them up. So these ones here I've overcooked a little bit, but they're good enough to use. And this squash was really easy. The skin just peeled right off. And most pumpkins are like that as well. I just thought I'd show you my sugar pumpkins from last fall. They do take up a lot more room in the oven and you'll get a lot more puree. So next I'm going to walk you how to make your own crust. I've included in here 2 different recipes for crust, a vegan and a non-vegan version. So the vegan version is slightly different. It uses vegetable shortening. It doesn't include an egg. And then the lard version includes either lard or butter as a base, and includes an egg as well. So this recipe is the one that I'll be using for the demonstration. It's a rather large recipe, so you'll have leftovers, but that's okay because you can use it in other recipes. It's something that freezes really well, which is nice. I'm going to get started by putting my flour in the bowl. This recipe calls for either baking flour or just all-purpose flour. I typically just have all-purpose flour on hand, so that's what I use. And I should also mention, if you have a gluten intolerance, you can use a gluten-free recipe. Bob's Red Mill is really great. It's a very nice pie crust. It's a little bit crispier than some crusts, but it works really well. And there's also some almond flour variations that I've seen. I haven't tried, but I've been a fan of almond flour in my baking. So I encourage you to try that out if you have an intolerance to gluten. So the first thing I'm going to do with the flour is just add a bit of salt, and then I'll toss that together just so the salt. So the next thing is going to be to add the lard. So to make this a little bit easier, you're going to want to cube it up. So you'll see here I'm just going to slice it up into large cubes so that I can mix it throughout the flour a little bit better. And this will be the same process for any of the crust options that you're using, if you're using Crisco or butter or any other variation. They don't have to be tiny chunks, just kind of small enough that you can mix them in. And most recipes will call for a pastry blender or some knives or forks to mix the dough. But I find that once I've cubed these, if I kind of toss them in the flour and coat them, that I can just use my hands to mix the dough. For me, it's a little bit easier to feel the dough so that I know I've kind of reached the right consistency when I'm mixing. Just kind of start squeezing the shortening into the flour. One thing about crust is you don't want to overwork it. So doing this and just kind of lightly squeezing it in is a good process for me. And you're going to just keep doing this until it gets kind of to the texture of coarse oatmeal. And you'll still have some bigger chunks in there. But that's kind of where you want to get to. So it takes a little while, but you'll get there. Crust is one of the things that are a little bit harder to learn how to make, but I think once you know how to make it, it's a great skill to have. As I said, you'll have extra with this recipe and you'll be able to make a lot of different things. You can try to make some tarts, some different types of pie. I'm just kind of mixing it up until I get that kind of coarse texture. It's going to be very floury still because we haven't put our liquids in. So it's looking pretty good. I'm just going to head off to wash my hands and get some of the flour off so I can do the rest of the recipe. I'm going to get working on the liquids now. For this recipe, you need 1 cup of total liquid. So what you need to do is put your vinegar and your egg in the measuring cup first. And once those are in there, you'll fill it up with water, up to 1 cup. And depending on where you live, if your altitude is different, So if your air is drier or more moist, you'll use more or less liquid. I find that 1 cup has always kind of worked for me. I'm just going to get rid of these eggs here. Fill up my cup. It's always a good idea to give your hands a bit of a rinse when you're working with eggs. You can get some types of food poisoning from raw eggs, so it's always a good idea to give your hands a rinse. So you can see there, I've just filled my cup up to the 1 cup mark. And I forgot to whisk my egg in vinegar earlier, so I'm just going to do that now, so it's blended up and ready to go. And you can just follow whatever recipe is on the pack. Like if you're working with Crisco, just follow the recipe on the pack. I find that those are the ones that have worked best for me. They're kind of the ones that the company have tested and they know work with their product, so I've always had the best results following the pack. So here I'm just going to mix in a little bit of liquid. You don't want to put it all in. You'll end up using it all, but it is a lot easier to mix if you just kind of mix in a little bit at a time. And that'll also help if you have like more moist or dry air. You'll kind of be able to guess or judge if you'll need more or less liquid. So it'll feel pretty dry as you're mixing it in, but it is getting pretty moist. Crust, it has a learning curve, like I said, so you'll want to make sure that you're not putting too much liquid in. But once it kind of starts to stick together, it's doing what it needs to do. So I usually get it to this point, and then in a minute I'll start working with my hands to kind of push the dough together. You don't want to overwork it. It's not like a bread dough. You don't need to knead this one. So usually when I'm in there with my hands, I'll kind of fold it over and try to squish the layers together. And that'll also help with the flakiness of your dough as well. So kind of just keep doing that till most of it's incorporated. Sometimes I'll have a little bit left over and I'll try to mix that in when I'm ready to roll out the dough. So once you have it together, you can just kind of form it into a big ball. I'm going to cut it in half here. Just be careful not to cut through to your countertop. Just for rolling out, it'll be easier to make it into smaller portions. This recipe makes a lot of crust. So even using half, I'm going to have more than enough for the pie that I'm going to be making. I have this lovely rolling pin that I made in high school. Yeah, so you just want to move it around so that your dough doesn't get totally stuck to the bottom or your work surface. So you always want to make sure there's a little bit of flour down. And you want to get it to about like a 1/4 inch thickness. I never measure, I just try to get it kind of to look like how thick I would want the pie crust to be. I'm gonna grab my pie plate. And another good option if you're not confident in making your own crust is that you can buy a pre-made crust. They're available in the store, and I think you can get gluten and gluten-free versions, which is really nice. So once you get to this point, you're just going to lift up your dough. Make sure you don't rip it though. Just kind of want to do it gently, and you can just lay it in your tray. And for this one I'm using a glass pie plate, but that's just what I had on hand. You can use anything. There's lots of nice ceramic versions or metal versions. If you don't have one, the thrift store is a really great place to find one. They're usually really cheap. And you can usually get some really nice like ceramic or glass ones. So I'm not usually really fancy when I'm doing the edges. I just kind of tear them off, and I'll get the bulk of the extra dough off, and then I'll go back around and just kind of clean it up. If you want to get really fancy though, there's lots of different techniques that people use, and you can find them online. Lots of different like pinching techniques or designs. If you're just starting out, then that might be more than you want to do, but the option's there. Kind of makes for a fun gift if you want to get really creative with your dough. I'm just going back around here and cleaning it up. Doesn't need to be perfect. You're just going to eat this, so it doesn't need to, it's not going in a magazine. That's my rule. It doesn't need to be perfect. You just don't want to leave it too rough, because sometimes the dough will kind of like get too crispy, or it may get too brown. So next I'm going to walk you through the filling. So I just got all my ingredients laid out here. I'm going to start by getting my pumpkin puree open. For this demonstration, I'm going to be showing you how to use the canned version. This one's kind of convenient because it's the exact amount of pumpkin that I need for the recipe. If you're baking your own, you'll kind of just end up with however much puree the pumpkins make. So you can add more or less. If you're close to 3 cups, you can add more or less to the recipe, or save some on the side for other things. Pumpkin is really great in all types of baking. You can use it in place of eggs, or just as a flavor enhancement for different recipes. I've got a great muffin recipe that I'll also include with the recipe that comes with this video. You can also make, if you want, if you like coffee, you can put a couple tablespoons of this pumpkin aside to make your own pumpkin coffee or pumpkin latte. So the next ingredient is going to be some condensed milk. For this recipe, I'm just using a dairy version, but if you have some intolerance to dairy or an allergy, you can use, there's a coconut milk version that's available. It's a little bit smaller of a can, but it'll work just as well. You can just use it in replacement of this one, or of a standard can, I should say. It's a little bit hard to get it out of the can, but I like to try and get out as much as I can. Just makes it a little bit easier for getting it ready for recycling. So the next thing you're going to want to put in is your eggs. And again, if you have either an allergy or you don't eat eggs in your diet, just omit these. The recipe works with or without eggs. You'll just get a slightly different texture without eggs, but it will work. And if you want, you can add a little bit extra liquid by putting in some oil, but it's certainly not necessary in this recipe. I have a family member who's allergic to eggs, so I often make this recipe for them without the eggs, and it works great. And I just make sure that I change my my dough recipe as well. The next thing is going to be your brown sugar. So you can use regular brown sugar. That's my preference for this recipe. But there's also brown sugar alternatives that some of you may use already, or if you're wanting to try, you can use them as well. There's some nice coconut sugars that you can get, which work really well in replacement of brown sugar. And for this recipe, I've put in that you can use 3/4 cups to 1 cup. So depending on what kind of pumpkin you're using or the sweetness level that you prefer, you can adjust that amount. Usually I try to cook with sugar pumpkins because they're kind of meant for baking and cooking. But if you just have a regular pumpkin, you can use a little bit more sugar because a regular pumpkin is not going to be quite as sweet as a sugar or a baking pumpkin. And at this point, I do like to mix it all together before I put my spices in. It helps just distribute the brown sugar and get everything kind of nice and ready to go for your spice. And if you find that it's a little bit lumpy, that's okay, because as you mix in the spices, the brown sugar will kind of dissolve. I'm using a spatula here just because that's what I used to clean out the cans, and I like as little dishes as possible. But you can also use a whisk here if that's easier for you to kind of blend in the ingredients. Sometimes when you're new to cooking, it is a little bit easier to use different tools if you're not used to handling them as much. So I'm going to get into the spices here. I think, as I said before, there's lots of different pumpkin mixes that you can get for spices, but I prefer to use individual spices. You get a little bit more for your money, and you get a lot of flexibility if you need to change the recipe or if you want to do other cooking. So I tend to just have things individually. So I just have like cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. But the spice mix does come in handy if you want to save on some pantry space, or if you just want a quick solution. It's also good for the coffee that I was talking about if you want to have a mix ready to go. But you can also make your own. If you've got an extra little jar, you can just mix in kind of the amounts that I've given you on the recipe, and you can have a little jar of your own pumpkin spice mix. And you'll just want to watch cinnamon. If you haven't cooked with it before, it can be quite fine. It's a quite fine powder. So sometimes if you mix too quickly at the beginning, it'll kind of get all over the place. And I love putting the spices in because you get a nice dark pumpkin color that comes out of the spices. And you can see already that some of the lumps that I had in the brown sugar earlier are already gone. Once they're sitting in there, they just kind of dissolve. So you're ready to fill up your pies now. So you can see here that I've pulled out the pie crust that I prepared earlier. And I've also pulled out a frozen pie crust, which is another option if you're not ready to start making pie crust, or if you simply just don't have time. So it's a good option. This recipe makes enough filling for 2 pies, so I figured I'd show you both options. I like making my crust because, like I said, you can use it for a lot of different things, and it is quite a bit cheaper. And I'm not too picky, but if you're picky, you can kind of smooth the top down, because this filling is thick and it's just gonna kind of sit how it sits. But I'm not very picky. It's kind of like I said earlier, you're just gonna eat it, so it doesn't need to be perfect. So here's the pies in the oven. That's your next step. So I put them in at about 400 degrees, and I normally cook them for about 40 minutes, but depending on your oven, they'll take different amounts of time. I usually go until like the crust looks done, and as long as the insides don't look like they're raw. So it'll have a little bit of a wiggle, but it shouldn't look like it just went in the oven. So 40 minutes is a good starting point. And here's my piece of pie that I enjoyed after making. It kind of gives you a visual of what it should look like. So I wanted to thank you for watching my video of how to make a pumpkin pie. I hope that you found this valuable and useful in your cooking journey, and I hope this recipe brings you joy. For many years, myself or my family have had a garden over the summer, a garden that has always included pumpkins. I've had the pleasure of sharing them with family and friends, watching kids pick out their favorite, and I've enjoyed using them in my cooking. So I've been passionate about learning how to grow and prepare my own food for a long time, and I'm passionate about sharing those skills and the recipes that I've made. It's important to me that we become more self-sufficient in preparing our food. By learning how to grow and cook our own food, we can understand what it takes to produce what we need to live, and we can establish a healthy connection with what we are eating. My love for pumpkins comes from their diversity, versatility, and hardiness, their ability to facilitate connections between people. Gardening, cooking, and baking are historically things that bring people together. And while we may not be able to be together safely right now at all times, we can still share recipes and we can cook for each other at a distance. Swap baking with your friends and family, drop a pie off at a family member's house, or donate them to someone in need. This video was made possible by the Make Anything Care Microgrant, presented by the Institute of Humanities at the University of Manitoba and QPOC Winnipeg, with support from Mentoring Artists from Women Artists, MAWA.